24th, 1945, the entire country waited to see Stalin on the podium of the Mausoleum. The victory parade was supposed to be his personal triumph, but the leader never appeared on Red Square. Why did the man who led the greatest victory in history remain in the shadows at the moment of celebration? What was behind this mysterious decision? Today, we will reveal the truth about one of the main political mysteries of the 20th century. If you are interested in this historical mystery, subscribe to our channel and like our videos. In the comments, we will discuss a controversial question. Was Stalin's policy towards popular military leaders after the war correct? We look forward to hearing your opinions. Victory came at an incredible cost to the Soviet Union. 27 million people died, cities were destroyed, and villages were devastated. But the enemy was defeated, and the Soviet Union needed to show the whole world its power and the triumph of justice. The idea to hold a grand military parade on Red Square arose even before Germany's final surrender. As early as April 1945, when Soviet troops stormed Berlin, discussions began in the Kremlin about the future triumphal march. Stalin understood the importance of a symbolic end to the war. The parade was to be not just a demonstration of military strength, but a real theatrical performance capable of impressing the Allies and warning potential adversaries. The General Staff was tasked with working out all the details of this grand event. Moscow was preparing for the largest parade in its history. Rumors spread throughout the capital that captured German flags would be brought to Red Square, and that representatives of all fronts and branches of the military would take part in the celebration. The planning of the parade was conducted in the strictest secrecy. Even the highest military commanders did not know all the details of the upcoming event. Stalin personally supervised the preparations, approving every detail, from the order of the regiment's march to the musical accompaniment. He wanted the whole world to see the triumph of Soviet arms. Particular attention was paid to the symbolic component of the parade. It was planned that the culmination would be the ceremony of throwing fascist banners at the foot of the Mausoleum. This idea was born in the depths of the party apparatus and was personally approved by the leader. Such a gesture was supposed to demonstrate the final defeat of Nazism. Practical preparations began in May. Selected units began to arrive from various parts of the country. Every soldier who was to march across Red Square underwent a thorough selection process. The requirements were strict: impeccable military bearing, perfect uniform, exemplary behavior. Moscow was turning into a huge military camp. The residents of the capital watched the preparations for the celebration with bated breath. After 4 years of war, blockade, and deprivation, the parade was perceived as a long-awaited liberation from the nightmare. People decorated their windows with red flags, prepared festive clothes, and rehearsed songs from the war years. Meanwhile, the final organizational issues were being decided in the Kremlin. The main one was the choice of who would host the parade. Traditionally, this honor belonged to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Everyone expected Stalin himself to appear on the Mausoleum tribune in his marshal's uniform. However, the leader, as always, had a surprise in store. His decision puzzled even his closest associates. Stalin clearly had something in mind, but he was keeping his plans secret for the time being. There were only a few weeks left before the parade, and the intrigue was only growing. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was officially over, and now the question of the parade became particularly relevant. Stalin convened an emergency meeting of the Politburo, at which the final decision was made to hold a solemn march on Red Square. The date was not chosen at random. June 24th was the day when, exactly 4 years earlier, Nazi Germany had treacherously attacked the Soviet Union. The symbolism of this date was obvious. Where the tragedy had begun, justice was to be served. The enemy would be defeated on the anniversary of its crime. The Politburo unanimously supported the leader's initiative. Molotov suggested inviting representatives of the Allied powers to the parade, but Stalin categorically rejected the idea. The celebration was to be an exclusively Soviet triumph. There were to be no foreign guests on the Mausoleum tribune. Beria took responsibility for ensuring the security of the event. The state security services began a mass check of everyone who could be near Red Square on the day of the parade. Moscow was literally combed through in search of potential violators of public order. The regime of secrecy was tightened to the limit. Kaganovich oversaw the technical side of the preparations. It was necessary to ensure the flawless organization of troop movements, prepare the square, and install additional stands for guests of honor. Every detail was repeatedly checked and approved at the highest level. Particular attention was paid to the ideological component of the parade. The propaganda apparatus was tasked with preparing appropriate coverage of the event in the press and on the radio. The parade was to be the apogee of the triumph of socialist ideology over fascism. Khrushchev proposed organizing public festivities after the official part, but this initiative was also rejected. Stalin wanted the parade to remain a strictly military event, without any frills. Discipline and order were to characterize the Soviet celebration. Malenkov took on the task of coordinating the work of all departments. The parade required the participation of many organizations, from the Ministry of Defense to Moscow's municipal services. Everyone had to work as a single mechanism, without the slightest disruption. Gradually, other details became known. The parade was to include combined regiments from all fronts and representatives of all branches of the armed forces, including the Air Force. A special place was reserved for the demonstration of the latest military technology, which had helped to defeat the enemy. But the main intrigue remained undisclosed. Who would host the parade? This question concerned not only the top leadership, but the entire country. Logic suggested that this honor should belong to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. However, Stalin remained silent, and his silence gave rise to new rumors and speculations. The question of who would host the victory parade became a source of serious debate in the highest echelons of power. According to all the canons of military protocol, this honor should have belonged to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Stalin himself. But, to the surprise of those around him, the leader began to lean toward a different decision. The first candidate for the role of parade host was Marshal Georgy Zhukov. His authority among the military was unquestionable. Zhukov commanded the assault on Berlin, accepted Germany's surrender, and his name was associated with victory more than any other. Military logic dictated this choice. However, Stalin hesitated. On the one hand, Zhukov truly deserved this honor for his military exploits. On the other hand, the leader did not want to elevate the marshal too much in the eyes of the people and the army. The cult of personality had to remain the monopoly of one person, Stalin himself. Other candidates were also considered. Marshal Rokossovsky was highly respected in the army and could have presided over the parade with dignity. His Polish origin even added symbolism, a representative of the liberated Slavic people presiding over the victor's celebration. Konev, Vasilevsky, Tolbukin, each of these outstanding commanders had merits worthy of such an honor. But political expediency required a more subtle approach. Stalin understood that the choice of the parade host would send an important political signal. Unexpectedly, Zhukov himself intervened in the discussion. The marshal was summoned to the Kremlin for a personal conversation with Stalin. The content of their conversation remained a secret, but the result became known quite quickly. Zhukov would host the parade, and Marshal Rokossovsky would command it. This decision appeared to be a compromise, but in fact reflected a deep political calculation. Zhukov received the honor he deserved, but did not become the sole hero of the celebration. Rokossovsky also received his recognition, and Stalin himself remained above the fray, maintaining his status as an unattainable leader. Military circles met this appointment with understanding and approval. Zhukov was indeed worthy of such an honor. He was hugely popular in the army, and the soldiers would have been proud to see their beloved commander reviewing the victors. But another question remained. Where would Stalin himself be during the parade? Traditionally, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief was supposed to take his place on the Mausoleum tribune alongside other leaders of the country. Everyone expected to see the leader in full-dress uniform, receiving reports from the troops. However, Stalin had a surprise in store here as well. His plans were becoming increasingly mysterious, and even his closest associates could not guess what the leader had in mind. There were only a few days left before the parade, and the intrigue was only heating up. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov became the central figure in the preparations for the parade. The marshal understood the full responsibility of the mission entrusted to him. Accepting the parade of victors was not just an honorary duty, but a crucial political act that would go down in history forever. Zhukov personally supervised every aspect of the troops' preparations for the solemn march. He demanded impeccable military bearing, perfect appearance, and precision in all movements. The marshal knew that not only millions of Soviet citizens would be watching him, but the whole world. Particular attention was paid to the choice of horse for Zhukov. The marshal was to ride across Red Square, receiving reports from the commanders of the combined regiments. The horse was chosen from among the best representatives of the Kremlin stables. The animal had to be not only beautiful, but also absolutely calm. Rokossovsky, appointed commander of the parade, worked closely with Zhukov. An excellent working relationship developed between the two marshals. They complemented each other. Zhukov was responsible for the ceremonial side, while Rokossovsky was responsible for the technical organization of troop movements. Rehearsals took place from morning to evening. The combined regiments practiced their ceremonial march. The tank crews trained to drive their vehicles in strict order, and the pilots prepared for the air parade. Every detail was honed to perfection. But the closer the day of the parade came, the more tension grew between Zhukov and Stalin. The leader was clearly jealous of the marshal's growing popularity. Zhukov was called the savior of Moscow, the conqueror of Berlin, and now he was also becoming the hero of the victory parade. Stalin began to show his dissatisfaction through petty nitpicking. Either Zhukov's uniform was not formal enough, or the horse was unsuitable, or the route needed to be changed. Each remark was a painful jab for the marshal. The political undertones were becoming increasingly obvious. Stalin could not forgive Zhukov for his military glory. In the post-war period, the leader intended to restore his absolute monopoly on honors and recognition. Marshals who were too popular became an obstacle to these plans. Zhukov sensed the cooling of relations, but tried not to show his concern. The marshal understood that any display of ambition could be interpreted as disloyalty. In Stalin's system, this was deadly dangerous. Nevertheless, preparations for the parade continued. Zhukov demonstrated exemplary discipline and diligence. He knew that the parade should be a triumph not only for him personally, but for the entire Red Army. Personal ambitions gave way to historical duty. A few days before the celebration, it became clear that a serious rift had developed between the leader and the marshal. Stalin increasingly made critical remarks about Zhukov, who, in turn, became more and more reserved and cautious. This hidden struggle between the two titans of Soviet power was to be resolved on the day of the parade. But no one could predict what form the final confrontation between the leader and his most successful commander would take. A week before the parade, rehearsals reached their peak intensity. Red Square was transformed into a huge military parade ground, where all elements of the solemn march were rehearsed day and night. The parade participants lived in a state of constant readiness, understanding the historical significance of the upcoming event. Combined regiments arrived in Moscow from all fronts. Each regiment represented a specific direction of military operations. There was a regiment of heroes from the Leningrad Front, Stalingrad, and Belarus. Soldiers and officers were selected according to strict criteria: participation in major battles, combat awards, and impeccable character references. The flag bearers were to occupy a special place in the parade. They would carry the battle flags of renowned units and formations, as well as captured German standards. The ceremony of throwing the fascist flags at the foot of the Mausoleum was prepared as the culminating moment of the entire celebration. The aviation component of the parade required special preparation. Pilots practiced group flights over Red Square, synchronizing their passage with the movement of ground troops. The air parade was to be a powerful demonstration of Soviet military aviation. The technical part of the parade was impressive in its scale. The latest tanks, self-propelled artillery units, and Katyusha rocket launchers were to pass across Red Square. Each vehicle underwent thorough technical preparation and exterior finishing. The musical accompaniment was prepared by a combined military orchestra conducted by the best military conductors. The repertoire included traditional military marches, songs from the war years, and solemn melodies. The music was intended to create the appropriate emotional backdrop for this historic event. Parallel to the military preparations were underway on Red Square itself. Workers installed additional stands, renewed the paving stones, and decorated the facades of buildings. Moscow was preparing to present itself to the world in its best light. Journalists and cameramen received accreditation to cover the parade. The event was to be recorded for history in every detail. Filming positions were placed so as to ensure maximum coverage of the event. But the main mystery remained unsolved. Stalin did not announce his participation in the parade, although everyone expected to see the leader on the podium of the Mausoleum. His silence gave rise to all sorts of speculation and conjecture in the corridors of the Kremlin. Zhukov continued his preparations, but felt a growing tension. The marshal understood that his relationship with Stalin was at a critical point. Any mistake during the parade could have catastrophic consequences for his future career. Muscovites eagerly awaited the big day. After 4 years of war and deprivation, the parade was seen as a long-awaited celebration of justice. People prepared their festive clothes, taught their children songs from the war years, and excitedly discussed the upcoming event. The day before the parade, all preparations were completed. The participants received their final instructions. The equipment was lined up in marching columns, and the orchestras rehearsed the final passages. All that remained was to wait for the morning of June 24th, 1945. The morning of June 24th, 1945, greeted Moscow with rainy weather. Gray clouds covered the sky over the capital, and a light drizzle threatened to spoil the celebration. But the parade organizers were prepared for any whims of nature. Too much depended on the success of this day. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Moscow time, the first parade participants began to arrive. The combined regiments took up their positions in the Sokolniki area, from where they were to move to Red Square. Tank columns lined up on the approaches to the city center. Everything was ready for the historic celebration. Zhukov arrived at the Kremlin before dawn. The marshal donned his parade uniform, checked the final details of the ceremony, and received his final instructions. His white horse, Kumir, was already waiting in the Kremlin stables. There were still several hours left before the parade began. Rokossovsky coordinated the movement of troops from the command post. Communication with the columns was maintained by radio, and every step of the parade participants was controlled down to the smallest detail. The slightest glitch could ruin the entire effect of the celebration, so vigilance was at its highest. By 8 in the morning, spectators began to gather on Red Square. The stands were filled with party officials, military personnel, and representatives of the public. Everyone understood that they were witnessing a historic event that would go down in the history books and remain in the memory of generations to come. At 9 o'clock in the morning, party and government leaders ascended the podium of the Mausoleum. Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, and other members of the Politburo took their places. But Stalin was not among them. His absence immediately became a subject of whispering and confusion among the distinguished guests. The time was approaching 10 in the morning, the start of the parade. The participants in the celebration took their starting positions, the orchestras tuned their instruments, and the cameramen checked their equipment. Moscow froze in anticipation of the triumphant march of the victors. Meanwhile, the rain continued, turning the cobblestones of Red Square into a slippery surface. This created additional difficulties for the cavalry and tank crews, but no one thought of canceling or postponing the parade. History does not tolerate delays. At 9:30, Zhukov rode out of the Spassky Gate on his white horse. The marshal looked solemn and confident, despite the drizzling rain. He was followed by Rokossovsky on a black stallion. The two illustrious commanders headed towards the troops. The crowd in the stands greeted the marshals with thunderous applause. At last, the long-awaited celebration had begun. But many continued to look back at the Mausoleum tribune, wondering why the main hero of the great patriotic war, Stalin himself, was not there. The mystery of the leader's absence became increasingly obvious. Even foreign journalists who had been given permission to cover the parade wondered about the whereabouts of the Soviet leader, but no official explanation was given. Meanwhile, Zhukov began his tour of the troops. The marshal greeted each combined regiment, received reports from the commanders, and delivered the traditional words. The soldiers responded with loud cheers, but there was a palpable tension in the air due to the absence of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. While Zhukov was touring the troops, Stalin was in his Kremlin office. The leader had not slept all night, pondering his decision not to attend the parade in person. It was one of the most difficult choices of his political career, and he understood all the possible consequences. From the window of his office, Stalin could see what was happening on Red Square. He watched as Zhukov, riding a white horse, received reports from regimental commanders as the troops lined up and as spectators gathered in the stands. But he himself remained in the shadows, hidden from the eyes of the participants in the celebration. The decision not to appear on the podium was not an easy one for Stalin. On the one hand, he understood the symbolic significance of his presence at the parade. The people expected to see the victorious leader, the triumphant commander under whose leadership the great victory had been won. His absence would inevitably raise questions and speculation. On the other hand, Stalin felt that appearing on the podium alongside Zhukov might diminish his own role in the victory. The marshal had already received too many laurels, and further elevation of his figure was politically dangerous. The cult of personality does not tolerate competition. There were other considerations as well. Stalin had never served in the army in the sense that professional military men understood service. He was a political leader, a party functionary, a revolutionary. Appearing in military uniform among combat generals might have looked out of place. In addition, the leader always preferred to remain somewhat aloof from public events, maintaining an aura of inaccessibility and mystery. Too frequent public appearances could diminish the effect of his rare appearances before the people. Political mystique required a measured presence. Watching the parade from the window, Stalin analyzed the reactions of the participants and spectators. He saw how people looked back at the Mausoleum tribune, searching for his figure. Their bewilderment was obvious, but this was part of the leader's plan. Mystery had always been part of his image. At one point, Stalin approached the telephone and contacted Poskrebyshev, his secretary. He instructed him to prepare a brief statement for the press that the country's leadership was watching the parade from the Mausoleum tribune. Formally, this was true. Part of the leadership was indeed present. Meanwhile, a grand ceremony was unfolding in the square. Stalin saw the combined regiments marching, the military equipment passing by, and the planes flying overhead. The celebration was a success, despite his absence. This was an important observation for future political calculations. The leader understood that his decision would go down in history and be discussed for decades. Historians would construct theories, memoirists would share their memories, and political scientists would analyze his motives. But he would never reveal the real reasons publicly. By the end of the first part of the parade, Stalin had made the final decision not to appear on the podium, even for the ceremony of throwing the German flags. This was his final choice, and he was ready to take responsibility for all its consequences. Remaining in his office, Stalin continued to watch the events unfold. The parade went according to plan, the participants demonstrated high training, and the spectators enthusiastically greeted the victors. But the main mystery of the day remained unsolved. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning on June 24th, the victory parade began. The drummers of the combined military orchestra were the first to enter Red Square. Their drum beat echoed off the Kremlin walls, heralding the beginning of the historic celebration. The drummers were followed by the orchestra, playing a solemn march. Zhukov rode his white horse, Kumir, to the center of the square. The marshal looked majestic and solemn, despite the drizzling rain. His parade uniform, medals, and Hero of the Soviet Union star sparkled even in the cloudy weather. It was a moment of supreme triumph for the victorious commander. Rokossovsky, the parade commander, rode behind Zhukov. The two illustrious marshals symbolized the combat brotherhood of Soviet military leaders. Their appearance in the square was met with thunderous applause from the spectators, but many still searched for Stalin's figure on the podium. The first to march in the solemn procession were cadets from military academies. The young lieutenants demonstrated impeccable drill training. Their steady pace, synchronized movements, and proud posture made an indelible impression. They were followed by representatives of various branches of the armed forces. The combined regiment of the Leningrad Front carried the battle flags of the heroic defense. These soldiers had endured 900 days of blockade and defended the city on the Neva from the fascist invaders. Their faces, hardened by war, expressed pride in their duty and joy at victory. The regiment of the Stalingrad Front represented the defenders of the city on the Volga. It was here that the backbone of the German military machine was broken, and it was from here that the great offensive of the Red Army began. The soldiers of Stalingrad marched with particular solemnity, understanding their role in the overall victory. The Belarusian front was represented by units that liberated Minsk and participated in Operation Bagration. These troops went from defense to a victorious offensive, liberating their native Belarusian land from the fascist occupiers. The Ukrainian fronts sent their best representatives, soldiers who liberated Kiev, Kharkov, and Odessa. They carried the banners of the units that crossed the Dnieper, stormed the enemy's fortifications, and drove the fascists westward to Berlin itself. Each combined regiment had its own history, its own military achievements, its own heroes. The parade became a living chronicle of the Great Patriotic War, where each participant personified a certain stage of the struggle against the invaders. The history of the war passed before the spectators in the faces of its participants. Representatives of the Union republics occupied a special place in the parade. Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani units reminded viewers of the multinational character of the Soviet people. The war united all nationalities in the struggle against a common enemy. Marines, pilots, artillerymen, tankers, every branch of the military was represented in the parade. It was a demonstration of the power and diversity of the Soviet armed forces, which had managed to defeat the strongest army in the world. As the troops marched past, Stalin's absence became increasingly apparent. Journalists, diplomats, and ordinary spectators were puzzled by the empty space on the Mausoleum's podium. But the parade continued, captivating everyone with its grand scale. The parade reached its climax when the flag bearers entered Red Square with captured German standards. 200 soldiers carried the banners of the defeated fascist units, from divisional to regimental. Among them were the standards of the elite formations of the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Luftwaffe. It was a visible embodiment of the defeat of Hitler's military machine. At the head of the column of flag bearers was Senior Lieutenant Kotov with Adolf Hitler's personal standard. This trophy was captured in the Reich Chancellery and symbolized the final defeat of the Nazi regime. Hitler's standard with a black swastika on a red field evoked special emotions among the participants and spectators of the parade. The ceremony of throwing the fascist banners at the foot of the mausoleum became the most dramatic moment of the celebration. One after another, the flag-bearing soldiers approached the podium and threw the enemy banners onto a specially prepared platform. Each banner thrown symbolized the defeat of another part of Hitler's army. The audience greeted this ceremony with bursts of applause and shouts of hurrah. Many cried with overwhelming emotion. 4 years of war, millions of victims, countless sufferings. All this found its symbolic conclusion in the act of trampling on the fascist symbols. Hitler's personal standard was thrown last. Senior Lieutenant Kotov threw it with force at the foot of the mausoleum, where a pile of defeated banners already lay. This gesture signified the final victory over the main enemy of humanity in the 20th century. After the ceremony with the banners, the military equipment began to pass by. The legendary T-34 tanks, which had become a symbol of Soviet tank power, were the first to rumble across the square. They were followed by heavy IS tanks, self-propelled artillery units, and armored personnel carriers. The Katyusha rocket launchers made a particularly strong impression. These formidable machines struck terror into the enemy with their fire and the howling of flying shells. Now they were solemnly passing across Red Square as symbols of the technical superiority of the Soviet military industry. Artillery guns of various calibers demonstrated the firepower of the Red Army. From light anti-tank guns to heavy howitzers, all this equipment had seen combat from Moscow to Berlin, supporting the advancing infantry with fire. The ground part of the parade ended with a cavalry march. Despite the development of military technology, horse-mounted units retained their importance and romantic aura. The riders on bay and black horses looked particularly impressive against the backdrop of the Kremlin walls. The air part of the parade was opened by Yak and La fighters. Combat aircraft flew over Red Square in strict order, demonstrating the skill of Soviet pilots. The fighters were followed by Il-2 attack aircraft, bombers, and transport aircraft. The final chord of the air parade was the flight of heavy bombers. These machines participated in raids on enemy industrial facilities and supported the advance of ground forces. Their appearance over Red Square concluded the demonstration of Soviet military aviation. But even at the moment of supreme triumph, many participants and spectators of the parade continued to wonder about Stalin's absence. His empty seat on the Mausoleum tribune became increasingly noticeable and gave rise to various speculations about the reasons for the leader's non-participation in the celebration. By the end of the parade, Stalin's absence had become the main topic of discussion among spectators. People openly wondered why the Supreme Commander-in-Chief was not participating in the victory celebrations. Whispers and guesses spread through the stands faster than official information from the organizers. Foreign correspondents who had been given permission to cover the parade bombarded their Soviet escorts with questions about the whereabouts of the Soviet leader. Official representatives responded with vague statements that the country's leadership was present in the stands, but it was obvious to everyone that the main protagonist was not there. The diplomatic corps was also puzzled by the situation. The ambassadors of the Allied powers expected to see Stalin at the moment of triumph and to have the opportunity to congratulate him on the victory. The absence of the Soviet leader disrupted protocol plans and created awkwardness in diplomatic circles. There was confusion among the high military command. Generals and marshals understood the political background of what was happening, but could not comment publicly. Military discipline demanded silence, although many had their own opinions about the situation. Zhukov, who was reviewing the parade, felt a particular tension. The marshal understood that Stalin's absence was somehow connected with their relationship. The political intrigue surrounding his person reached its peak on the very day of the commander's greatest triumph. Rokossovsky, who commanded the parade, tried to focus on technical issues, but even he could not help but feel the strangeness of the situation. Two marshals conducted the parade without the presence of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, an unprecedented event in Soviet practice. The members of the Politburo on the Mausoleum tribune looked somewhat confused. Molotov, Beria, and Malenkov tried to maintain a solemn appearance, But the absence of their leader made their position ambiguous. They were forced to represent power without its main symbol. Ordinary participants in the parade, soldiers, officers, sailors, also noticed Stalin's absence. Many of them had fought in the war under the slogans, "For the motherland," "For Stalin," and expected to see their leader at the moment of celebration. His absence was perceived as something inexplicable. Muscovites on the streets of the city, who were following the parade on the radio, were also puzzled. Radio commentators avoided mentioning Stalin's absence, which only heightened the curiosity of listeners. The city was full of rumors and speculation. Cautious discussions of the situation began in party circles. Mid-level officials did not dare to make direct assumptions, but the atmosphere of uncertainty was felt by everyone. The country's political life was entering a new phase. By the evening of June 24th, it became clear that Stalin's absence from the parade was not an accident or the result of a sudden illness. It was a conscious political decision, the motives for which were to be unraveled by contemporaries and descendants. The parade ended, the troops dispersed to their units, and the spectators went home. But the main mystery of the day remained unsolved. Why did Stalin not appear on the podium at the moment of the greatest triumph of his political career? This question became historical and demanded an answer. Immediately after the parade, various rumors spread throughout Moscow about the reasons for Stalin's absence. Some claimed that the leader was seriously ill and could not leave his quarters. Others spoke of political disagreements within the country's leadership. Still others put forward a version about a conflict between Stalin and the military. The medical version seemed the most plausible to the general public. Stalin was already 65 years old. The war had taken a heavy toll on him, and the stresses of wartime could have undermined his health. Ordinary citizens were ready to believe that the leader had sacrificed his presence at the parade in order to conserve his strength for state affairs. However, those closer to power understood that it was not a matter of health. Stalin regularly appeared at various events, received foreign delegates, and worked according to his usual busy schedule. There were no signs of serious illness. The political version was based on rumors of disagreements in the Politburo over post-war policy. Allegedly, serious contradictions arose between Stalin and his closest associates regarding the future of the country. His absence from the parade could have been a form of protest or a demonstration of discontent. The military version linked Stalin's absence to his relationship with the army leadership. Zhukov's popularity among the troops had reached such heights that it could threaten the leader's monopoly on the people's love. The parade could have further elevated the marshal, which was politically undesirable. There was also a version that Stalin did not consider himself worthy of receiving the parade. The leader allegedly believed that this honor should belong to those who directly commanded the combat operations. He remained the political leader, and the military celebration should be conducted by the military. Some suggested that Stalin's absence was due to his unwillingness to share the glory of victory with anyone else. Appearing on the podium alongside other leaders could have created the impression of collective leadership, which contradicted the principles of the cult of personality. There was also a version circulating that Stalin was preparing a political reshuffle in the country's leadership. The parade could have been the moment when resignations or new appointments were announced. The absence of the leader created intrigue and kept everyone in suspense before the upcoming changes. The religiously minded part of the population saw Stalin's absence as a sign from above. June 24th was the day the war began, and the symbolic absence of the leader on this day could be interpreted as atonement or repentance for past mistakes. The intelligentsia offered a psychological version. Stalin, as a subtle politician, understood that his presence at the parade could overshadow the exploits of ordinary soldiers. By remaining in the shadows, he emphasized the role of the people in the victory, rather than his own merits as supreme commander. Each version had its supporters and opponents. The lack of official explanations only fueled interest in this mystery. People discussed what had happened in communal apartments, at work, and in lines for food. The parade became not only a celebration of victory, but also a source of political intrigue. By the end of June, the rumors had reached such proportions that the party authorities had to take action. Local party committees were instructed to stop the misinformation and focus on celebrating the victory. But the curiosity of the citizens could no longer be stopped. A few years after the parade, memoirs of participants began to appear, shedding light on the mystery of Stalin's absence. In his memoirs, Marshal Zhukov hinted at serious disagreements between him and the leader on the eve of the celebration. These hints allowed for a new look at the events of June 24th. Zhukov wrote that Stalin had long hesitated about his participation in the parade. The leader allegedly changed his mind several times, first agreeing to attend the celebration in person, then entrusting the matter to the marshal. Such indecision was uncharacteristic of the usually iron-willed leader. The marshal's memoirs also contained more specific details. Stalin allegedly admitted that he did not feel confident enough in the saddle to ride across Red Square on horseback in front of the entire country and the international community. This version seemed plausible, given the leader's dislike of public appearances. Rokossovsky also touched on this topic in his notes. The marshal claimed that Stalin considered the parade to be an exclusively military event, in which only professional soldiers should participate. According to the leader, the political leadership should have remained on the sidelines of this celebration. Molotov expressed a different point of view in later interviews. According to him, Stalin did not want to overshadow the feat of ordinary soldiers with his presence. The leader allegedly believed that the parade should be a triumph of the victorious people, not a personal celebration of the political leader. In his testimony after his arrest, Beria mentioned Stalin's serious illness on the eve of the parade. The head of the NKVD claimed that the leader's blood pressure had risen, and doctors had categorically forbidden him from appearing in public. However, this version seemed doubtful, given that Beria was giving testimony under pressure. Malenkov hinted in private conversations at the existence of political motives for Stalin's absence. Allegedly, serious disputes broke out in the Politburo about the post-war structure of the country, and the leader decided to demonstrate his dissatisfaction with the position of his colleagues by not appearing at the parade. Khrushchev offered a psychological explanation in his memoirs. In his opinion, Stalin feared that his appearance at the parade as a triumphant figure could evoke undesirable associations with Roman emperors or European monarchs. Such an image contradicted the image of a people's leader. Kaganovich claimed that Stalin's decision was dictated by considerations of state security. The large crowds, foreign journalists, and complex operational situation all created risks that the security services could not fully control. Mikoyan offered another version. Stalin allegedly wanted to avoid having to give a speech at the parade. The leader was not sure that he would be able to find the right words for such a historic moment, and preferred to shift this responsibility to the military. Voroshilov hinted in his notes that Stalin considered the parade premature. The war with Japan was still ongoing, and complete victory had not been achieved. Appearing at the parade could have created the impression that the USSR considered the war to be over, which was politically inaccurate. All these memories and versions created a confusing picture of the motives behind Stalin's decision. Each memoirist offered their own explanation, often contradicting others. The truth was lost in a sea of assumptions and political interpretations. It was only after the opening of the Soviet archives in the 1990s that historians gained access to documents that could shed light on the mystery of Stalin's absence from the victory parade. The archival materials of the party, the government, and the leader's personal secretariat contained valuable information about the events of June 1945. The minutes of the Politburo meetings showed that the question of Stalin's participation in the parade was indeed discussed at the highest level. The documents record various proposals for the organization of the celebration, including options with and without the leader's personal participation. Of particular interest were the entries in the diary of Stalin's secretary, Poskrebyshev. These documents recorded the day-by-day preparations for the parade and the leader's hesitations about his participation in the celebration. Poskrebyshev noted Stalin's frequent mood swings and his indecision on this issue. Medical records from the Kremlin hospital contained no mention of any serious health problems for Stalin in June 1945. This refuted the version that illness was the reason for the leader's absence from the parade. His health during that period was relatively stable. Correspondence between the various departments responsible for preparing the parade showed that decision-making was chaotic. Stalin would give instructions to prepare a place for him on the podium, then cancel those orders. The organizers were in a constant state of tension, not knowing the final decision. Documents from the security agencies contained detailed plans for ensuring the security of the parade, taking into account Stalin's presence. These plans were repeatedly revised and adjusted depending on the leader's changing decisions. The NKVD was prepared for any scenario. Transcripts of Stalin's telephone conversations with various participants in the parade preparations showed his growing irritation and uncertainty. The leader asked many questions about the details of the ceremony, but avoided giving clear instructions regarding his own participation. Entries in the logbook of visits to Stalin's Kremlin office showed that Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and other military leaders came to see him on the eve of the parade. The content of these meetings was not recorded, but their frequency indicated the seriousness of the issues discussed. The archives of the Ministry of War contained documents on the preparation of various options for the parade ceremony. Scenarios involving Stalin, only Zhukov, or several marshals at once were considered. Each option was worked out in detail. Diplomatic documents showed the Allies' reaction to Stalin's absence from the parade. American and British representatives in Moscow sent dispatches to their capitals requesting clarification of the situation. The absence of the Soviet leader raised serious questions among the Allies. Soviet press reports at the time carefully avoided any mention of Stalin's absence. Newspaper reports on the parade were written in such a way as not to draw attention to this fact. Censorship was particularly thorough in its coverage of this event. Personal letters and diaries of parade participants found in various archives contained vivid impressions of what was happening. Many noted the strangeness of Stalin's absence, but only offered cautious guesses about the possible reasons. An analysis of all available sources has allowed historians to identify several key political reasons for Stalin's absence from the victory parade. The main one was the growing popularity of Marshal Zhukov, which was beginning to threaten the leader's monopoly on popular recognition and admiration. By the end of the war, Zhukov had become a true national hero. His name was associated with the Red Army's greatest victories: the defense of Moscow, the Battle of Stalingrad, the lifting of the blockade of Leningrad, and the capture of Berlin. The marshals' popularity among the troops and the population reached unprecedented heights. Stalin, who was always jealous of other people's glory, could not help but notice Zhukov's growing authority. Appearing at the parade alongside the triumphant marshal could create the impression that the victory was achieved through joint efforts, rather than the sole genius of the leader. This contradicted the principles of the cult of personality. In addition, Stalin feared that the parade could become Zhukov's personal triumph. The marshal presided over the celebration, rode on a white horse, and received reports from the troops. All eyes were on him, not on the country's political leadership. Stalin's presence on the podium could only emphasize the secondary nature of his role at that moment. There was also a deeper political calculation. Stalin understood that the post-war period would require serious changes in the leadership of the country and the army. Overly popular military leaders could become an obstacle to the restoration of the party apparatus's absolute power over the armed forces. The war had temporarily changed the balance of power in the Soviet system. The military had gained considerable influence, their prestige had grown, and they had become independent in their decision-making. In peacetime, Stalin planned to return the army to strict party control, and popular marshals stood in the way of these plans. Absence from the parade was a way of showing the military their place in the post-war hierarchy. Stalin demonstrated that he could do without participating in their celebration, that political power was higher than military glory. It was a lesson in humility for the arrogant commanders. The psychological aspect also played an important role. Stalin was never a military man in the traditional sense of the word. He did not command units in battle, develop tactical plans, or direct operations directly at the front. Appearing among combat generals might have seemed out of place. In addition, the leader always preferred to remain in the shadows during mass events, appearing only at key moments for maximum effect. The rarity of his public appearances increased their impact on the audience. Too frequent appearances could diminish the magic of his presence. The international factor was also important. Stalin did not want to give his allies a reason for criticism. Appearing as a triumphant figure at the parade could have led to accusations of militarism and imperial ambitions. It was better to present the celebration as a holiday for the liberating people. There was also a version that Stalin was preparing a political reform of the country's system of government. The parade could have been a convenient moment to announce important decisions, but the leader preferred to postpone these plans and use other opportunities. Finally, one cannot rule out an element of personal animosity towards Zhukov. The marshal was too independent, too self-confident, too popular. His successes irritated Stalin, who was accustomed to all the country's achievements being associated exclusively with his name. Thus, the political motives for Stalin's absence from the parade were multi-layered and interrelated. This decision reflected the complex struggle for power and influence in the post-war Soviet Union. Stalin's true motives for remaining in the shadows during the victory parade were most likely a complex combination of personal, political, and psychological factors. The leader did not make this decision spontaneously, but as a result of lengthy reflections on his place in history and the future of the country. The main motive was the desire to preserve and strengthen his power in the post-war conditions. Stalin understood that the war had changed many things in the country and society. People saw other heroes, other leaders, other idols. It was necessary to restore the monopoly on popular recognition gradually and cautiously. The parade performed by Zhukov was to be the marshal's last triumph. After that, Stalin planned to gradually reduce his influence, transfer him to less significant positions, and limit his contacts with the troops. Military leaders who were too popular in peacetime became a political danger. Psychologically, Stalin always preferred the role of a behind-the-scenes puppet master to visible public activity. He liked to control events from the shadows, leaving the role of performers to others. This style of leadership created an aura of mystery and omnipotence, which was important for maintaining the cult of personality. His absence from the parade was also intended to demonstrate that Stalin was above ordinary human weaknesses, such as vanity and the desire for public recognition. The leader was supposedly so confident in his historical significance that he did not need the applause of the crowd to confirm his status. There was also an element of political theater. The mystery of Stalin's absence was intended to generate numerous versions and discussions, which ultimately attracted even more attention to his person. Sometimes absence makes a greater impression than presence. The international aspect also played a role. Stalin did not want to appear to his allies as a military dictator reveling in victory. The image of a wise political leader standing above the military turmoil was more in line with his plans for the post-war restructuring of the world. Perhaps the leader's personal complexes also played a role. Despite all his power, Stalin felt insecure among professional military personnel. He had never commanded troops in battle, and may have feared that this would become apparent during the parade. The influence of superstition cannot be ruled out either. June 24th was the date of the outbreak of war, a tragic and painful day for the country. Appearing at the celebration on this particular day might have seemed inappropriate or even sacrilegious to Stalin. The decision not to participate in the parade was also a demonstration of strength. Stalin showed that he was so confident in his power that he could afford to miss an important event without damaging his authority. It was a demonstration of absolute political independence. Ultimately, Stalin's absence from the victory parade became part of his political strategy for the transition from wartime to peacetime construction. War required one type of leadership, peace another. The leader was preparing for new challenges and new tasks. The historical irony is that by avoiding the glory of others, Stalin created his own mystery, one that would outlive many triumphs and defeats. His absence from the parade became more famous than the presence of any of the participants in the celebration. Thus ended one of the most intriguing pages in the history of the Victory Parade of 1945. The mystery created by the leader's silence continues to intrigue historians and ordinary people, reminding us of the complexity of human motives even in the most solemn moments of history.